Hello everyone, let us cover the solution for another in-class problem where we are given 3 arguments in colloquial language and we are asked whether those arguments are valid or not by abstracting its core logical structure. Now this exercise asks you to try to evaluate the truth tables, but hopefully throughout this video we're going to realize that that is not really necessary if we keep into mind the definition of our 4 main propositional arguments. So as a quick reminder, during class we discussed these 4 main logical structure. We said that these 2 are always valid and these 2 are fallacies, or in other words, there is no guarantee that they would actually lead us to a correct conclusion. So we talked about modus ponens and modus tollens. These are 2 valid reasoning arguments. They both share the same premise. We have a causal relationship between A and B. So if A, then B. In modus ponens, what we say is that if then we observe the antecedent here, then it is safe to assume that the consequence should also be here. Because if this relationship is true and I observe this condition here, then it makes sense to expect that the consequence is also happening. Now, modus tollens tells us something similar. If this relationship here, this looks like a D. If this relationship here is true and I observe that the consequence has not happened, then that must mean that the condition also didn't happen. Again, because if this is true and the condition had happened, then there's no way that the consequence was not there. Then we have 2 fallacies. Affirming the consequence, that tells us something similar. We have the same premise, if A, then B. But in this here, it's warning us that if I observe the consequence, it is not necessarily the case that the condition was also there. So this is a fallacy. There might be other conditions that led to the same consequence, even though this condition always leads to this consequence. And then we have denying the antecedent. Again, same premise, if A, then B. And we are warned here that not observing A is not evidence enough for affirming that, this should be a negation here, that B is not going to happen. So this is also a fallacy. So the first argument for which we have to question or for which we have to evaluate the validity is the following one. If I press the gas pedal, the car will accelerate, but I didn't press the pedal, therefore I conclude that the car will not accelerate. So to judge whether or not this is a valid argument, we're going to have to abstract its core components. So here we're going to forget about the exact content of each sentence. We are simply going to break down the structure. So we have if this happens. So notice here how I am ignoring the content. If this happens, so I have if A, then the car will accelerate. So I have here an if, then this happens. Regardless of whatever the content is, this could be abstracted as A, then B. So we have here this first premise. And then, let me move this a little up. We say that I didn't press the pedal. So now I am denying that this condition happened, whatever the content is. And then I am inviting this conclusion. So that means that the car will not accelerate. So I am denying the consequence that I have affirmed here. And we can see here from abstracting the logical structure of this argument that this is a fallacy. This is what we refer to as denying the antecedent. So this is not a valid argument. It's not necessarily true. So the second argument for which we have to judge the validity says something like, if I read the news, then I will not be misinformed, but I was misinformed, so I did not read the news. So again, we're going to evaluate its validity by breaking it down to its abstract notation. Again, I have here a relationship of the sort, if this happens, then this second thing happens, and I am kind of ignoring the content. Now, this problem is a little tricky because it contains a not. There are 2 ways in which this can be expressed. I am going to start by ignore this not and keep the core instruction of abstracting the structure that we have here. So if I read the news, whatever this is, if this condition happens, then this consequence will occur. So I have here again, if A, then B. And then I observe that I was misinformed. Now, this is the only instance where we are going to pay attention to this not, because here, by not having a negation, we know that this is negating this right here. So we have, and I was misinformed. So then I suggest the conclusion that that must mean that the condition was also not met, so not A. And here, hopefully, we can identify that this is just another instance of our modus tollens type of argument. So this is a valid reasoning. Because if I had already established this relationship, and if this relationship was truth, regardless of whether I truthfully believe that reading the news is enough to not be misinformed, if this was a truth, and I didn't demonstrate that I was actually not misinformed, therefore it must be true that I didn't read. So if this is true, and this is what I observed, then it must be true that this is a right conclusion. Now, another way of writing this down, because I know that it's weird in the English language to work with double negatives, we can also express this as respecting the not that I have here. So we could also have, alternatively, express this as if A, then not B, or let me respect the notation, then not B. So here B is now being misinformed, and this is a negation. So if I read, then I will not be misinformed. And then I observe that I was misinformed. Therefore, it must be the case that I did not read the news. So it does not matter here that I have switched these signs, whether I have the negation here or here. In any case, we are observing here this swap. And in any case, this swap right here between what I have established in my first premise and what I observe, it's going to be enough evidence for me to guarantee that then the condition was not met. Because again, if this were true, regardless of what you believe, if this were true, if I don't observe this consequence, or if I observe that this consequence was not satisfied, then it must be true that the condition was also not there. And then finally, we have the following argument here expressed as if the moon is made of cheese, then it will taste like cheese, but the moon is not made of cheese, therefore it will not taste like cheese. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of ignore the content of the sentences and just break it down to its core notation, abstract the logical structure here. So again, I have here, if this condition, then this consequence. So I have here A, then B, where A is that the moon is made of cheese and B is that it will taste like cheese. And then I observe that the moon is not made of cheese. So I am negating here my condition and not A. And I finish by hinting or signaling this conclusion, then it will not taste like cheese. This would be the structure of the argument that I have above. And luckily, we have already identified that this is yet another instance of denying the antecedent. Again, this is a fallacy. Just because we established that this particular condition always results on this consequence does not mean that whenever this condition is not there, then the consequence is also not going to be there. That is not evidence enough. This is a fallacy. And luckily with that, we have also demonstrated that even though you could have tested the validity of these arguments by constructing the corresponding compound propositions and then evaluating the whole truth table, that is not really necessary if we start by simply abstracting and localizing or identifying what the structure of the propositional argument is, and try to link that with one of our already known propositional arguments. So modus ponens, modus tollens, or the two fallacies, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequence.